So I'm thinking about this noumena phenomena thing, by which I mean this problem, which is only a problem for me, I think, but you know, if you're striving for some kind of objective materialism, or if you kind of went into that as an idea, which I am, then you're on a cleft stick. Well, on the one hand, you have to... Let me just restate this, because I said this in a previous video. You know, if you look at something like, I look at a car like this Volvo that's in front of me here, you know, does that Volvo exist as it is, as I'm seeing it somehow, in objective reality? Or is it... no, let me rephrase that. Does it exist in a way which is different to the collection of properties that it exhibits, either to me as an entity with sense organs, or to a collection of measuring instruments, you know, speed cameras and light gauges and sound detectors, whatever, you know? Does it exist separate from the possible measurements that can be taken of it? And what I was saying in my previous video, which is still bugging me a bit really, is that if you say that it's just a collection of its properties as it appears on measuring instruments, or the measuring instruments of one's own senses, then it still feels a bit like solipsism to me. And I know, Piero, you said something different, but if you say it has some kind of other existence out there in the world, separate from the collection of properties that it exhibits to any and all measuring devices, then you're into metaphysics. Now, Piero, your response to that, which was to do with models, properties and models, I think the video was called, what you were saying there, which I think was a kind of partial resolution to it, but it's still a problem for me, is that these things just exist as models. You're constantly modelling the world out of its, by a sort of aggregate of its properties, and yes, these models that you create, they have a kind of phenomenal existence, but I'm still stuck as to what their ontological existence is. Do they? Because you seem to be still saying there, Piero, that they're. Well, I'm not quite sure what you're saying, because sometimes you seem to be saying that there is. I think one of the phrases you used was on the other side of perception, or beyond perception, and that's kind of it, because there's this interiority, exteriority thing to all this, isn't there? You know, the exterior is the world of the objective world, whatever that is, and the interior is the world of the phenomena, the experience, the readings on the readings on the various instrumentations, and of course we're not into naive realism here. For naive realism, there is this stuff out there in the world. There's a Volvo out there, and my senses, the perceptions that I have, are just a kind of window, like the screen of this car, and then there's a representation inside my brain of that, and there's a pretty close match between the representation and reality, because, as I say, perception is just transparent. That's kind of how naive realism works, but none of us are arguing that, I don't think. We all know that's rubbish, because the senses, the window that you look through, if you like, is such a narrow little sliver of awareness. You know, we can only see a tiny amount that the world offers to us, and we can only see within certain scales and frames that that we know that it's not like that. And when we move the sliver up and down a bit, you know, to look at the very, very, very small or the very, very, very large, it all gets, you know, a bit weird and pear-shaped. You know, it all gets quantum, or it all gets relative, in the Einsteinian sense. So it's all, you know, you can't really do that, or you have to kind of admit that naive realism falls apart really, really quickly. But there's still the window, you know. I mean, we're still looking through the window, and even in your modelling thing, you're still making gestures towards a world outside the window, the world beyond perception, ultimately inaccessible perhaps, but nevertheless a world of things in themselves. I don't think there's any way around it, to be honest. At least I haven't found a way around it, because all the metaphors that we have of talking to ourselves and to others about this and conceptualizing this uses this interior, exterior, window in the world thing, you know, something like it. And as long as that's in place, we're always going to have that noumena-phenomena divide. I mean, the nearest thing I've got to it, this is not It's probably very similar to yours in some ways, actually, to be honest, Piro. The newest thing I've got to it is what I've called the Shimmering database. I was reminded of it because in your video, Piro, you used the word shimmering and you talk about information. And I think, and that that resonated with me because I talked about the Shimmering database. So I'm just kind of imagining, what would the world be like if it was a database, and this database, or if there's a database which perfectly describes every single entity, every single property in the world, all of the, not just the properties that our senses can gather, not just the properties that our instrumentations can gather, but also any potential properties, any properties at all. So all the properties of every entity in the world, and every possible configuration of entities, are listed in this huge relational database. And I kind of imagine as shimmering. And when we access the world through our senses, we're effectively putting queries into that database. We're querying the database. It's these are search terms. Our eyes, our ears, our fingertips are searchers. And just like a database throws up data, usually in the form of a table, but possibly in the form of a graph, so our senses throw up the data in the form of experience. This stuff that I'm looking out the window at now. Anyway, that got me on to thinking about this database, because databases aren't really human readable in their raw state. You can't open up a SQL database or an Access database and just kind of understand it. They're not human. They're not readable really in any kind of meaningful sense. You have to read them through their search terms, through queries. So I'm thinking about that, and I'm imagining what you could do with that. Because I think, as I mentioned, databases. When you do a search in a database, it usually brings up tabulated data. That's probably the most common form of it. I use them a lot at work. So I get lists of students, or lists of marks, or lists of course materials, or whatever it may be. That kind of thing. But of course, you can also the database will also display that information in a different form. It'll display it as a bar chart, or a graph, or a pie chart, something like that. It'll do that. And certainly there are ways of doing it which make those databases do more. I'm reminded of that TED talk by Hans Rosling, really nice talking he gave about visualizing certain data. And I can't remember the data he was using now. It's to do with the economic state of sub-Saharan African countries, I think. But he's talking about, he basically displays database-derived visualizations, but these are animated. So instead of them just being simple, two-dimensional charts of, graphed information, the information moves, so you can see change over time. So it just looks like an animation. It's fantastic. So you can do that with a database. So I'm kind of imagining what else you could do with it. And here I'm imagining plugging a database into a rapid prototyper. Rapid prototyper is a device that they use in design, particularly in computer-aided design, CAD applications. And it's just like a machine, actually. It's a big box, like a machine, but there's lots of tools inside it. And basically you plug it into your CAD program when you've designed a product. Usually it's usually product design. So you've designed some kind of product in a CAD program, an authoring program, and you want to see what it looks like. You want to prototype it. So you feed the data from this from the program, really just data. So effectively items in the database into your rapid prototyper, and the rapid prototyper carves a piece of material that you've got inside the rapid prototyper, carves it to the shape of the product that you've designed in the virtual space. So you're transforming it from data into a rendered image. Or another way of putting that is the rendered image is another way of displaying the data. You know what I mean? But it's in this case, instead of just being able to look at it, you can also handle it. You can take the object out of the rapid prototyper and hold it up to the light and move it around to see what it feels like. You run your hands across it. So it's kind of haptic as well. It's not just a visual thing. It's a haptic experience. And you can kind of imagine doing that with allowing other kinds of data to flow into that. I mean, they can't yet, but you can easily imagine that. It could be quite easy to take data from the database so that the object that's produced in this rapid prototyper as perhaps a temperature. You know, you could feel it. Parts of it are warm and parts of it are cooler. You can easily imagine that, I'm sure. Or take data to change the surface of it. So some parts of it are shiny and some are matte, or maybe some parts of it have got a different texture. You know, some of it's like sandpaper, some of it's spongy, some of it's furry. You can do that. And I guess you could also do something like the thing that Hans Rosling does with visualizing data on that TED Talks. You know, there's no reason why you couldn't feed in changes to the data set over time. So the object that's produced by the rapid prototyper, be a pretty advanced rapid prototyper of course, in addition to, it wouldn't be static, it would change over time. So you'd have this object which was moving in there over time, which you could touch it, you know, and you could hold it in your hands, and you could, you know, feel the fur on its back, you know what I mean, and feel the scratchiness of its paws, you know what I mean. And basically you've got a rabbit by the time you got to this point, but it's still just a rendering of the data. And I guess if you got to that point, you'd really be starting to think about what the difference is between the rabbit and your hand you're holding it in, you know what I mean. You'd probably be thinking, well, maybe my hand and the rabbit's hand are exactly the same. They're made of the same molecules. If you put the right stuff in the machine to begin with, they're made of the same molecules. They seem to have the same structure. They seem to have the same blood vessels running through them. They seem to. The rabbit yelps when I stick a pin in it, just like I do. You know, I think at that point you'd start to wonder if you weren't yourself part of a rapid prototyping engine, driven by some database, possibly the same database that produced the rabbit. Then I guess that, yeah, you have to try and gain control over it, I suppose, wouldn't you? You'd have this moment of realization. Fucking hell, we all live in a relational. It's just a relational database, and we're all being rendered by this rapid prototyper. And then you get your mind into gear, and you'd be able to stop bullets, wouldn't you? And all the world would start drifting like these green zeros and ones down the screen, like in the Matrix, because it's seen behind the implementation of the data to the data itself, and realise that everything is just this data. It's all this one shimmering database. And we're all just queries and search terms, something like that.